the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we do want to mention briefly we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider sacrificing $1 a month to save your immortal souls. This week, Taylor and I are going to be discussing the first 4 chapters of Rene Girard's Violence and the Sacred.
I will say I have mixed feelings, but
some ambivalence. Would you characterize some
little ambivalence, just like the child vis-a-vis the father? No, yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, the theory is broad enough that elements of it are obviously going to have
resonate. Yeah.
For what we read today, I think the thesis about sacrificial crisis and violence would obviously withstand some scrutiny. And we'll get into that, obviously. And I guess that I find him to be a good reader of literature, which is pretty much what he's trained in. Now, I think this is why I shared with you some thoughts about his takes on anthropology. Obviously, he is not speaking as an expert on anthropology, even if he's widely read in it.
Certainly.
Just as we could say Deleuze and Guattari aren't experts in anthropology, ethnology.
Well, Freud as well, of course.
And Freud, right, in Totem and Taboo and in Moses and Monotheism. There's nothing wrong with that use of anthropology. We just need to be a little bit more... We need to take
circumspect?
Yeah, we need to be a little bit more circumspect, a little bit more, taking it with a grain of salt when he speaks and generalizes to the anthropological cases he mobilizes for his evidence. However, I think that that's not necessarily an outright indictment of him. I do think that in the later portions of the book, which we may want to look at, for example, chapter 7 is on Freud and the Oedipus complex. We might be able to do like a whole episode on that alone, revisiting portions of Anti-Oedipus.
That would be great.
For now, we can leave that aside, but that really is what he's kind of most famous for, I think, because he puts forward there, I think he gives a pretty good reading of Freud, I would say, and gives his strongest, or one of his strongest, mobilizes the strongest evidence for what he's best known for, which is his theory of mimetic desire. And there are elements of this in Freud himself. Basically, the father is the model. The child takes the father as the model. If the child is the son, right? Because usually for Freud, it's obviously going to be centered around the son, specifically the Oedipus complex, right? Duh. The father is the model of the son. And whereas Freud puts an emphasis on, or has the slippage between the father being the model and the mother being the object of desire, and Freud wants to err on the side of desire being object-based. So the mother is central. I think Girard wants to think of a kind of triangular theory where more emphasis is put back on this mimetic rivalry between the son and the father, where the son takes the father as, what Freud calls identification, as the model for his desire. And I think that Girard wants to show how Freud gets so close to this triangular theory and then avoids it. So Freud gets very close to Girard's mimetic theory of desire, but avoids it or eschews it. And what's interesting is you see in the 80s with the rise of like queer theory and gender studies, you'll see someone like Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick propose in her book Between Men something very similar, except on a homosexual basis, that so much of 19th century literature, for example, but also more broadly, you can see how so much of the plot or the antagonism revolves around two men desiring the same woman. And so the woman as object structures the field of desire for the males. And that's how the story evolves. And if you look at, and then she looks at queer literature and how if you invert this and you have two women desiring one man, the triangle usually collapses and the women end up in a kind of, they just like, why do we need the man anyway? Let's just make out, right? And so her theory is how the woman in the triangle of the men serves not only to anchor and structure the field of desire, but to prevent homosocial tensions to becoming outright homosexual relations.
Is that what threaten the reproduction of the social or some shit like that?
Yeah, I mean, you could just say in general, it ballasts heteronormative culture, heteronormativity writ large. So yes, that's part of it.
Does that very well mesh with kind of anti-Oedipus to some extent?
I think so. I mean, what you just said would be in an anti-Oedipal framework. And so that makes a lot of sense. And a generally kind of like Marxist framework. I think just in broad strokes, you could say heteronormativity, but you could also say like in order to participate in polite society, at least at that time, and even still some today, right? That one needs to be like heteronormative, heterosexual. That's just, so it is even the reproduction of a certain type of culture.
Subjectivity even.
Yeah, a certain type of subjectivity. Exactly. So I think that we should revisit Girard for that theory. But what we're studying, what we're focusing today is what he wants to seek as the kind of basis for his theory of mimetic desire, which we'll leave to one side for now. Even if we can kind of talk a little bit about it, because he even does pretty good readings of Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex, the Sophocles tragedy.
Yeah. No, I got you.
I'm trying to speak for the audience. I know you're following me along, buddy. I guess I would just say that the basis for the theory is in the title, Violence and the Sacred, or you could even say violence and the sacrificial crisis. That's the phrase that sacrificial crisis is the phrase that I think resounds throughout these chapters. Although he uses other phrases, but maybe I'll let you. I didn't really respond too much. I spoke very broadly as well. I'm just trying to structure our conversation and maybe the future ones. But why don't you give me your response, your feelings about what we read for today, and I'll try to see if I can bounce off that.
My first broad take on what we read specifically would be that I do agree that his logic feels a bit sound in terms of the function of the sacrificial process or whatever the fuck is a way to mitigating the libidinal band from overheating, etc. Like, and the social, because of this sort of blood feud aspect of like this endless cycle of retribution. Now, what I would question,
and that's the scapegoat mechanism that you're very interested in, right? The way the scapegoat is almost a release valve for that pressure or that heat.
Exactly. What I would question, because I'm not as read up on Girard, maybe you could go through a quick down and dirty explication of what mimetic desire is. You don't have to do that now. Let me preface that with what I find really fascinating in his analysis and what we read was that there's something about the transferability or the substitution of violence from object to object. And my understanding or my read on the mimetic aspect of it is that this is almost like a Lacanian objet, right? Like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Or even going back to, let's say, what is it? Mourning and Melancholy. Yeah, right. The libidinal investment in the object. Well, it takes a while for those investments or whatever to.
One doesn't give up a libidinal position willingly or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, now that's
Howard Freud states it. I mean, I think he states that in that essay, right? He says
he does. He absolutely does, which I think I latched onto.
And I thought about the objet as well and thinking about what we read.
Yeah, because I was reading like the metonymy of the transfer or the substitution, to be specific to his language and Freud, the metonymy of the substitution of the object, right? It seems like in the way that he lays it out, the specificity of the individual that is sacrificed is less of an importance, which I think may go to one of the other strong implied logics being that, God, I lost my train of thought here.
The actual object of desire is less important, say the mother, than the structuring cause of desire, which is the identificatory rivalry between the father and the son. If we just stick to the Oedipus complex, like I laid out just a minute ago, because in an interesting way, the objet isn't really an object, not in the sense in which we think of,
it's like
of objects.
It's a circuit or something almost, right? Like
it's or an attractor or a magnetizer or a polarizer. If you think about like it's a vector or a vector space for desire, right? It orients it, if you will.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I mean, I'm trying we're using kind of metaphors here a little.
I'll restate what you just said in the way that I was thinking about the same thing. And that would be that it's not our ideas of morality that determine the punishment or the judicial system or any of that. Like that's a false assumption.
That's a modern view.
That's a modern view, right?
This is what Girard says, right?
I buy it. I have to say that I think that he's right in the sense that, it's the material structure of desire that really, that's the force, not the ideas about morality. He even argues that even in the quote unquote primitive societies that carry out sacrifice in this manner, that there's not a conscious understanding of what the function of the ritual actually is.
Yes. At least that's his implication, that in the background of the sacrificial crisis, right, which is kind of as rituals in the society, as ritualistic society, like maybe goes further away from the origins of the basis for sacrifice and maybe loses ground. This is what he even calls a delusion. And I think he really means it in a kind of almost strict sense where there's a veiling, if you want to be like Heideggerian about it, of the origin of sacrifice and its, if you want to say factual, real basis. Again, these are kind of slippery terms, but as one moves away in time and generation by generation of these rituals being performed, whether with sacrifice or not, the sort of origins of, or what he sometimes calls like the original victim of the violence that society unanimously puts onto that victim, as the origins recede in time, there's a kind of misapprehension.
I think that he's right in the sense that one thing that he does very well is articulate this shared maybe legacy or perhaps a functional legacy between the sacrifice and our modern judicial system. And I think he's right in the sense that, again, it doesn't matter, even in our modern judicial system, the emphasis on the specific individual that committed the crime is of less importance than the structure of justice being perceived to have been meted out, regardless of the actual victim. So it's more important that we get a conviction which reifies the power of the sovereign entity, whatever that may be, the king or the state or what have you. So it's more important for the society's macroscopic integrity for the perception of justice being carried out. There's more emphasis on that than in the specifics of the actual perpetrator of the crime getting their just desserts or what have you, right? It's more important that there be a perception of justice being meted out. That perception and reification of power and authority and the law and punishment, like that threat carries more weight libidinally than the actual, at the macro level. Obviously, we are less libidinally invested in retribution than the person who was directly impacted by the murder or whatever the crime would be, right?
This is where I think, in order to follow that thread, because you even brought up this question of, and he does talk about it at the beginning, but I think in order to follow that thread more fully, we would want to read someone like Agamben and Homo Sacer, and this question of who's right to justice, who gets the right to retribution, and how that plays out. Because I think for him, yes, this is in the background of the sacrificial crisis. And the problem would be, obviously, in diffusing that willfulness of, what do you call it, of vigilante justice, so to speak. For Girard, he looks at it in a very broad and structural sense, that if the victim seeks vigilante justice in each crime, then the violence inherent can never find a stop.
Maybe that's what I was thinking about as far as objet A, right? It's like that the libidinal investment in the it just hops from object to object. It doesn't really, the actual object is irrelevant for the most part, right? Like obviously he says the king or whatever, or maybe he does. Maybe I'm confusing shit, but the king has a higher mana level, right? Like, so when you sacrifice the king, that's a more powerful form of, because of his standing or what have you. Yeah, just like I was talking about with like Game of Thrones and the power of king's blood, the sacrificing attempted burning of like, what's his name? In the books, it's Edric Storm. It's Renly, not Renly, but the little blacksmith guy. Gendry is Robert Baratheon's bastard son, right? And Melisandre and Stannis want to sacrifice him because he's the son of Robert Baratheon, and so he's got the king's blood. He's got the king's blood, which ups the power level of the sacrifice.
Yeah, and one of the terms that he'll locate in Greek literature later on is called krudos, which is basically a kind of totemic endowment, if you will. From time to time, one can have krudos if one, for example, Oedipus is, in Oedipus Rex, if you think about it, he has become king out of this weird happenstance. He is endowed with this totemic power. He becomes tyrant in the Greek sense, tyrannos, right? He becomes ruler in a way that we don't imagine it being done in stereotypically by like father to son, even though technically he was the son, but whatever. I just meant to be, he's kind of an outsider who obtains a kind of totemic endowment. And so what Girard wants to say is like how krudos, this mana, this power of being, whether it be tyrant or not, is kind of it goes in these rhythms and these alternations. And the less matters individually which one becomes powerful than not. So like in Oedipus Rex, Oedipus is the oppressor, and Creon and Tiresias, etc., are the oppressed. But then in Antigone, Creon becomes the oppressor, Antigone becomes oppressed. In Oedipus at Colonus, Oedipus is no longer the oppressor, he is the oppressed, etc. So it's this kind of like alternating, it's what again, another Greek term, peripeteia, it's the turning of tables, the wheel of fortune, if you will. In any case, I guess that goes along with what you were saying about drive, desire, objet A as being the particular object, or let's say the particular surrogate victim, the scapegoat, is less important in their identity than the collective will unanimously choosing, or again, choosing is a weird word here. Selecting is also weird. You could say landing upon. It's almost like drawing lots in the
right.
Old
Yeah,
sense,
like what's
right?
that the lottery by? Is it Shirley Jackson? The lottery?
I think so. So it's very much not that that's how it would happen, but it might as well be chance, fate, in the broad sense, rather than we think of it as a kind of. He wants to argue that krudos and these themes of fate or chance, because that's kind of how it also translates to, is much stranger and looser than what we think of metaphysically in modern terms as like destiny. For example, Oedipus's fate was, you could almost say it's just the gods getting off. It's not really like some sort of destiny inherent in his like genetic structure or some sort. I mean, yes, you could say that there is a tragic flaw, but the tragic flaw, as Girard shows, is these fits, these outbursts of anger, whether it be defending himself and killing Laius on the road, whether it be lashing out at Tiresias and Creon, that they are like conspiring against him, with this story about how he's the cause of the plague, etc. Those fits of anger happen to all the characters, as Girard shows. And so this is the same kind of rhythm and alternate and circuit, to use your word. I think that one of the things that he wants to argue against is that if we read, and this is kind of your point about the justice system, if we read like Oedipus Rex or these Greek tragedies, Or even, I suppose, if we extend it broadly to the structures of primitive society and I guess just sacrificial society, right? If we want to be broad, if we read it with a modern sensibility, we're going to want to focus on the individual and locate like a hero a protagonist, an antagonist. And I think that Girard is trying to say, no, we really need to. It's kind of like you're reading the Greek tragedy and you're thinking of Oedipus as individual, or you have to do both things at once. Yes, you have to see sort of the tragedy in that, but you really need to listen to the chorus. It's the collective will, it's the collective, obviously desiring production, and the social for Deleuze and Guattari, one and the same, different regimes. We kind of have to think on those terms. I don't want to necessarily bring in anti-Oedipus because Girard has a critique of anti-Oedipus that I find deserves its own episode. Maybe we'll get to it when we do the Freud chapter. But I will say that one of the things, as maybe clear, but I'll try to reiterate just in general, this theory that there is on any society, as we know, whether it be in its founding, but also in its perpetuation, there is an originary violence that is perpetuated, that keeps it going. Even Kant talks about it this way.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, well, that's funny that you bring up Kant because I think that there's almost a categorical imperative at play here, maybe a twisted version in the sense that the process itself, and this would go to my other point about like the way that markets function in a similar logic. Maybe I should even preface that by saying my argument is that all societies are primitive. We're kind of full of shit if we think that we're more sophisticated.
That's Lyotard's little, by the way, just for the reader, libidinal economy. Lyotard has a section, I think it's like chapter.
Yeah, there are no primitive societies.
There are no primitive societies, or as a corollary, all societies are primitive, right? Go on.
My argument is he's right. He's kind of aligning with this too, that all societies are primitive because there's always this threat of violence. If we didn't have the justice system or the sacrificial system, which sort of operate in a similar mimetic function, that we wouldn't be able to have a society. My thesis is also this extends to markets because markets, very much like the justice system, are not predicated on the specific individual level of meritocracy.
The winners and losers.
As long as the general thrust is towards, just like the justice system, it's not about the specific person that's being punished.
Go up.
It's about the process of justice being perceived to have been met. So markets allow the perception of economic justice or meritocracy, or you could even go to
that ideology to keep functioning. Is
that or like even destiny or fate or determinism. If you're even going back to like the sort of Calvinist basis for some logics of capital, only 144,000 are saved or something like that. So there's like a predestined class of entrepreneurs, just to be an example. There's a predetermined group. Doesn't matter the individuals that fall in that group. That's irrelevant at the sort of molar or macro level. It's just that the general thrust has to be that the system is equitable. Again, not the specific, it's just the broad general thrust of the system has to be perceived to be operating as it's designed. Just like the judicial system. And I think going back into Freud's totem and taboo, I think Freud in particular is applying this similarity between the evolution of the individual unconscious or whatever perceptual apparatus and that of the macro or molar society level, the way that the development of the unconscious forces,
the phylogenetic and the ontogenetic,
the way that like in the child, all of the drives are sort of, they're in this gestational state where they're all sort of connected in a sense. They haven't like individuated out into these specific organs, like the way that society would function, right? In the sacrificial society, that germ of functionality is all very tightly wound between economics, religion, and law. In the sacrificial society, those things are far more integrated or less individuated than in our modern institutions, right? Now we have individuated institutions. This is economy, this is politics, this is religion, this is the judicial system, and so on and so on. Does that make sense?
I think that you're right, and that there's a way in which, again, this is why Girard's theory about sacrificial crisis is perhaps broad enough to apply not just to apply across cultures. It has a universalist flavor to it. And I think that's why I generally am a little skeptical, a little suspicious of it, and wonder how much we can rely on it to explain things, especially since he seems pretty high on himself, thinking that like he's like the first to see this, and or at least the first to like put all these little pieces together. And even one of the things that he says about religion, and I'm trying to find it, he says religion instills nonviolence paradoxically through violence in a regulatory fashion. And I think that that's really helpful. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying. And I'm going to try to tie this in with what you brought in.
I mean, that would even go into my aspects of the market as a regulatory system, I think,
yes,
right?
Yes,
that
yes.
sublimates this violence of, I guess, jealousy or what have you, like the perception of
mimetic desire,
the perception of the equality of chance that is put forth by the market process, by the market working out the collective will, effectively, unconsciously selecting the classes, who falls in whatever class. Shit, I lost my train of thought. But I had a good fucking point. God damn it. Hopefully it'll come back. But sorry, I interrupted you anyways. Maybe it'll come back when you're talking.
So if we assume that there is a founding violence to society, as I know when I brought up Kant, he's really thinking about the state, but we can just be broad and say society. If there is a founding violence that is also has to be perpetuated in order to keep things running, in order for the structure to hold, in order for the codes to do what they do and ensure what Girard wants to call, he'll want to say that when this happens, this is why religion, as he says it, paradoxically uses violence in order to instill or regulate, uses.
This is some Hegelian logic right here.
Hold on. He says religion instills, so religion brings about nonviolence paradoxically through violence in a regulatory fashion. And so I guess one of the ways that he tries to argue is that if we think, again, this phrase, sacrificial crisis, we can think of it as the degeneration of the codes of society, of religion in this sense, right? As religion breaks down, as the rights fall apart, or as there is some sort of crisis in general. If you think about Oedipus Rex, beginning with the crisis of the plague at Thebes, and there needing to be some reason, cause for that. And it turns out to be Oedipus. It turns out to be this violation. If the violence I think for Girard is when society is working smoothly, whatever the fuck that means that the codes are running, the trains are running on time. Violence may be occurring, but it is a part of the originary violence and it has its place. It is regulated. The rituals are fulfilled. The gods are happy. The king is doing his job by making sure the crops grow and all this shit. But also, as we just mentioned, and I brought up Agamben earlier, because we were talking about the justice system versus and how it ensures and metes out justice, as you were saying, versus the victim having to take justice into their own hands. A vigilante system that, as you said it too, cycle of retribution. There is a sense in which a crime is committed or some sort of disorder occurs and violence threatens to perpetuate throughout the system in a way that is not regulated. And that for Girard and the way that where he finds it is what he calls the threat of the lack of differences and distinctions. And so I think for Girard, and this is a kind of a very Catholic way of looking at it, and a very, again, perhaps I'm not going to say Christian, but I think it's a very theologically oriented way of thinking about it, is once hierarchies, distinctions break down, once the codes are, once the flows start getting decoded and these other things, that's when violence becomes unregulated and threatens to spin out of control. That's what he thinks of as, I think, the sacrificial crisis. And the sacrifice, when we can think of it as the scapegoat, there is, I think for him, what Girard wants to do, and he looks at a lot of these things where a lot of it is the metaphor or the strongest metaphor for it, or the strongest stand-in, so maybe it's more of a metonymy, is fraternal violence, the brother against brother violence. We just looked at totem and taboo, right? So in a sense, the primal horde, if we want to take Girard's word for it, being the father, sort of primordial king of the horde, has to be put to death by the brothers and becomes the scapegoat in a way that Oedipus Rex is the scapegoat. It's when reciprocal violence, say between brothers or whatever, but that's just a metonymy. When reciprocal violence in the collective, when the differences and hierarchies are threatened, and the codes are decoded, etc., the collective will turns this reciprocal violence into a unanimous violence on one entity that is supposed to, as I use the metaphor of a vent, right? Vent the if there is a steam engine, vent the engine. But I mean, that's not necessarily the only metaphor you can use. But there is this sense in which Girard wants to see he says reciprocal violence, but I think that just means all against all. It's not even really just brother against
reciprocity.
Brother.
Yeah, it's like this. Yeah,
when the violence threatens to go out of control, that's when the that's when the scapegoat is brought in, and it takes up all of those, you could say, fears and that chaos, and is able to channel it and focus it. So this goes back to what you were saying about the objet, where, and this is why I was saying it's kind of a vector. Now, the object individually may not matter, but once it is landed upon, the scapegoat is landed upon, that's when it takes up. It could be any one thing, because we even see that it can be an animal and as a substitute, because in a certain way for Girard, the scapegoat is already a substitute victim, because for Girard, he wants to say that, in fact, the founding violence of the collective is always already a kind of putting to death of some, at the time, extraordinary individual. It didn't have to be a king necessarily, even though that can take on certain forms in certain traditions. They become extraordinary by being the scapegoat in a certain sense, right?
Like Christ.
Like Christ, exactly. Which is not even a dig. That's not even a dig. It's just
putting a pin on the logic. Yeah.
I think for Girard, he wants to see that there is at the basis, and again, whether this is real or fictional, I think is beyond the point, because I think this gets back into that mirroring game we had with Freud, where I always come back to this, where it's like, with the Wolfman, maybe it happened at 1.5 years, and he saw the coitus intergo and this, that, and the other. Whether that happened in reality or not doesn't matter, right? Because it is a part of we can even say it's a part of the mythos of the collective functioning of the society. There is a sense in which you can almost mathematically formulate it, or even put it into algebra. There is a kind of circulating, you could do parentheses or carets, whatever it is. There is a kind of way in which desire is crisscrossing, and then it becomes unilateral on this one entity, which eventually or potentially could be then substituted for with a goat, like in Abraham and Isaac.
One of the things that crystallizes this idea for me that all societies are primitive is the situation with Israel and the Palestinians, because I think very much this circuit of retribution and scapegoating and all of this shit absolutely is crystal clearly being worked out through this conflict. I think it really emphasizes.
I can't remember the name of the essay, but Deleuze, he wrote a few essays on the Palestinians, and I think it's called Stones, but I think the opening of the essay is basically that, the sins of Europe, which he's obviously talking about the Shoah, right? The murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. The sins of Europe are being paid for by the Palestinians. He basically opens that essay that way.
Yeah.
I have to go look and see if it's called Stones or if it's the other one I'm thinking of, and I think in Desert Islands. But in any case, yes, he very much opens with this logic of that you're saying, that in a certain way there's a collective scapegoating. Now, whether or not that explains everything, again, this is why Girard's theory is so broad enough to always kind of hit
that makes
some
sense,
of the truth. Obviously, it doesn't explain the whole conflict. It couldn't, but it gets at a kernel of truth about. I mean, I think that for Girard, he wants to look at any type of violence and see it there. This is why, for example, and you asked me to do mimetic desire, and I will only
I forgot about that even.
no, but I only give the broadest because I
yeah, that's fine.
I brought it up, but I'm going to reiterate just a little bit of what I said and add a corollary to it, and then maybe we can explore it further the next time we do, Girard. In the Oedipus complex, the way that Freud roughly outlines it in, I guess it's in the 1920s, towards the end of his life, he's thinking, okay, you have the father, and obviously you have the son. The son takes the father as the model. He identifies with the father. And the father doesn't have to be the biological father, obviously, right? It's a father figure.
The specific individual doesn't matter.
Exactly.
It's about the symbolic position or the functional.
Very much so, because Freud will always say phrases like the mother or her substitute. I love this phrasing. I wrote a whole essay about it because not that even my insights were original, but this question of the logic of it being the mother with like a capital T or a capital M is ancillary to the fact that, I mean, again, you think about the case studies we had with whether it be the rat man, but specifically the wolf man, so much of the acting out of the wolf man, for example, is with these caretakers, these like maids or servants, and they are obviously stand-ins. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, so the father figure is the model for, and this is like the name of the father shit with Lacan, although that's a whole, thing. The father figure is both the law, but also the model of desire. And this will be important, the question of the law. And the mother figure, again, doesn't have to be the mother, but we're assuming a kind of familial matrix here, right? Which is anti-Oedipus. I'm going to leave to a side, but you get what I'm saying. In the nuclear family, right? You got mommy, daddy, me, and I desire like daddy. Daddy is my role model, and mommy becomes my loved object because I see daddy loving mommy, and I want to be like daddy. And so she becomes the object. I desire to have mommy. Before I realize it, I am being told no by my model. No, you can't have mommy. She's mine. And I don't even realize that I am rivaling the father figure. I don't even realize that I am challenging the authority of the father by desiring mommy. I just want to be like daddy. I don't realize that I'm doing that. And so I initially, this is why Girard says that the Bateson's theory of the double bind is inherent in like all societies. It's not just endemic to the schizophrenic. Maybe the schizophrenic has a particularly severe case of it. Again, I don't know if I believe Girard, but so I am both told, or I am both, it doesn't have to be told explicitly, but I am both told, take daddy as my model, and I can't be or do like daddy because I can't have mommy. So I'm in this double bind. And so that already, before I even am aware of cultural norms in the adult world and whatever, I am already inserted into this double bind that is itself a kind of violence. This violent, no, you cannot desire like me. So yes, desire like me, be like daddy. Daddy wants you to be a good boy. No, you're a bad boy. You can't have what daddy has. So that double bind is initially violent. And this is why Girard wants to say that from that moment forward, that's the castration complex, right? We're already in Oedipus. We're in the threat of castration. And
I mean, that what you
castration. One last thing. So that castration is that from now on, all my desire will be wedded to a kind of violence, or will be inseparable from violence, or the threat of violence. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, brilliant.
And that's where rivalry. And so whenever I rival someone else for a specific object or whatever, then that's already going to be conflict. It's already going to imply violence because daddy said no. Now, this is very broad, and this is, again, it's broad strokes. It doesn't necessarily fit all cultures all times. But if we take it seriously and take it in its universal implications, and with enough grain of salt, obviously, but I mean, if we want to like test the theory out, we can think about this maybe a little bit. Does that make a little bit more sense now? Why mimetic desire is linked to violence and this conflict?
Yeah. It absolutely does. Although my question now would be, I was thinking about neuroticism and this double bind almost being like the cause of this, like this being pulled in the two directions, is the tension on the psyche that leads to this neuroticism, right? Because you're trapped in between these two poles of repulsion and attraction as far as desire. Everything is structuring in me to want the mother, but dad says no. So that blockage of the flow has a psychic cost, if that makes sense.
It does. It does.
Because I even, ironically, and I mean, first let me go back to, was it Moses and Monotheism, where Freud says that something about neuroticism and religion? Because I think even like I'm going to get real meta here and I think that there's some neurotic aspect to Girard himself that is getting worked out here. Even.
I think so.
Like in this, I don't know if it's this cultural, like white man's guilt or something. There's something weird about this. He has like a fetish about this libidinal catastrophe of violence or something, right? There's some, and he has an anxiety about this occurring in his like own time and place. Girard himself, I think.
I think he gives away the game, and this is to play into what you just said with the neuroticism. He gives away the game when he says, and he wants to apply this universally rather than just to tragedy, by saying it's the breakdown of differences. And by differences, he means distinctions, because he finds this in
like the universality of liberalism, right?
Yeah, you remember when he quotes Troilus and Cressida is the Shakespeare play that he quotes, that Shakespeare uses the term degree. The monologue is something about degrees becoming indistinguishable. Terrible paraphrase of probably a beautiful soliloquy, but it's just that this is why I think he shows himself eminently to be Catholic. You said it's kind of this white man's guilt, white man's burden thing, which is hilarious to me, and it does feel very conservative, if not reactionary. I'm not going to call him a reactionary yet. I think we need to look at how he reads Freud, and I actually think he's progressive in some instances, but his notion that it's the breakdown of distinctions, or the threat of the breakdown of distinctions, that forces the scapegoat mechanism to take hold. Otherwise, violence will spread throughout. It reminds me of, is it episode 2, or maybe it was the second episode of House of Dragons, since we were talking about Martin just a second ago. If you remember, at the start of the show, the two twins have died. The twins, each fighting for each side, and one twin kills the other and then kills himself. And if you remember, Girard even has some shit about twins, which we won't even.
Yeah, that was weird. Yeah,
but then we span out and we see there are these two neighboring villages in this region, and some like teenagers are kind of talking shit and being like, this is our land. It's like, no, you moved that landmark. This is our land. And then they start fighting, and it ends up that the two villages basically kill each other. This is the kind of shit that I think Girard is thinking of.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
About violence spreading out, and there needing to be a scapegoat mechanism lest everyone devolves into killing each other. And I think that for Girard, the instance in which distinctions are broken, this is why the twins mattered for him, because his point was kind of being that twins threaten the coding operations of the society.
Well, I don't think that there is canonically, these are not twins. These are two families, the Blackwoods and the Brackens. I wasn't sure exactly what you
but there were the twin mercenaries.
The two brothers that were Kingsguard on opposite sides of. Okay, I gotcha.
They were fucking twins.
Right. Okay.
Right? I mean, come on.
Okay.
Anyway, so I mean,
well, you threw me off because you were talking about the blood feud between those two.
But that happens right afterwards.
You're right. Yeah.
So
I gotcha.
I think that what Girard was saying about twins was that they are, again, not every culture treats them this way, but they tend to provoke a kind of paradox of coding, where the monstrous double of one another, they disrespect the way in which distinctions, degrees, as Shakespeare calls it, differences are layered and hierarchized in a society, and they are harbingers of a kind of disorder, chaos.
Interesting.
Which is why sometimes twins are put to death or whatever. Again, we have to treat his anthropological evidence very gingerly, right? Very lightly. And I guess that I would just say this is what feels conservative to me, is applying this universally, that it's the fact of the threat of order the status quo, even we could say today, we might say in modern terms. It's the threat of the status quo being disrupted that is the initiator or catalyst of the sacrificial crisis that calls for a scapegoat, which you do see something like this in Carnival, right? The notion of the beggar becomes the king, men dress up as women, this reversal of roles. And at the end of the day, once everyone has a good laugh and everyone goes back to being the beggar becomes the beggar again, the king becomes the king. These distinctions, they were just mocked and made fun of, now are placed back in a little bit more firmly, a little bit more solidly. So there is a logic to what he's saying to a certain extent, but it betrays a kind of conservative bent to think that, well, it's really when everyone knows their place. See, this is the implications that you could start to draw from Girard. Well, when everyone knows their place, we don't need to have a fucking scapegoat. It's when people don't know their place, you could start to read that way. And so I'm a little bit skeptical about this because I think it already is a way of disparaging revolutions or just calling into question the very mechanisms of power, if you want to be, again, broad or use a different type of discourse.
I mean, I definitely think that under liberalism, with its imposition of the universality, there is an erosion of the hierarchies in a sense.
Heteronormativity, patriarchy.
Right. The unconscious is still, in a sense, operating on this more primitive level than we are sort of consciously aware of, right? And we think, oh, we've achieved this certain state of evolution, etc. But it's only the materiality of our mode of production that enables this sort of to operate as it does, because the scapegoating mechanism is sublimated in the market, and the market attenuates the libidinal violence of and jealousy between the haves and the have-nots to some degree. Again, it doesn't matter what that the specific individual like Elon Musk is. Not every individual that is successfully chosen by the market has meritocracy by emphasizing their position. But as far as the system being perceived to be universally applied unconsciously by the group, by the society that participates in the marketplace, but we're not conscious of what we do when we make choices on the marketplace.
Well, this is again why I was trying to equate what you were saying with ideology. As long as it justifies or reinforces or legitimates the dominant ideology, then things are working well, then the codes are doing their job, then distinctions are kept intact, and therefore no need for a scapegoat.
Now this could be
no need for no crisis.
This could be the politics of the hysteric, perhaps, in the sense of like, there's always a test to see if the sovereign is actually powerful or something like that. The sovereign has to mete out justice. And again, it doesn't matter who the victim is of the justice, as long as the process is seen as being meted out, going back to the sort of Kantian logic of it, right? As long as that process is seen as just and being followed, then the outcome of the specific individual is completely irrelevant, because it's not about the individual. It's about the sustenance of the status quo, like you said. And I think that with the way that capitalism decodes the flows and the hierarchies that are sort of structured in the unconscious, like there is this anxiety or this like postmodern condition that exists where these two things are in tension with one another, and the center sort of cannot hold, so to speak.
I know what we should read for next week. I have to look up the book name, but this line of,
because I mean, even Stirner would go to like, it's this imposition of, so it's almost like this, this like counter, this kind of reaction to modernity and its universal subjectivity that I think Girard and even Stirner would be responding to, in the sense of like, there's something sort of unnatural, or I don't know, that's kind of fucked up. I don't know if I want to say that, but
no,
I might have to excise that last little section.
There's a book we should look at for next week called Vestal and the Fasces, Hegel, Lacan, Property and the Feminine.
Ooh, that sounds pretty rad. Yeah.
I think I follow what you're saying, and I guess you're saying we should all sacrifice Elon Musk. to the invisible hand of the market.
Okay, so the people that can't create retribution are the ones that are selected to be sacrificed. So the market selects for those that can't.
Even Girard says something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely cribbing off of him, but I'm applying it to the market in a way that I don't think he does. But I think the operation, because again, going back to my earlier statements and the way that Freud is kind of making this metaphor between the development of the individual psychical apparatus and the group psychical apparatus, like they follow a certain similar logic, even though like maybe
for Freud they do. Yeah.
The specifics may be a little bit different, but overall, the general sort of thrust is in the same direction, that this process of evolution and how evolution itself occurs has a certain, like, I don't know, a slant, a preference towards a direction, or maybe it would even go towards the partiality of libidinal investments or something like that, right?
Yeah. Partiality in the way that, again, Deleuze and Guattari define it. Not in a part-whole relationship in the sense of the partiality of selection.
Yeah, like you like to lose, so I'm partial to being friends with you. Or I don't know, that's a shitty example, but
it's interesting, right? Because that is one of the ways that we form friendships, but like to really forge them and grow them. I think it's something that Deleuze says, like, you can't fall in love with someone, or you can't love someone unless you like seize upon and grasp that bit of madness in them, right? That little bit of wildness. It composes certain forces with your own, if you want to get Spinozistic about it, and boost your line and your composition in a way that is unpredictable and not quite rational, I think is what Deleuze is saying, right? I mean, like, you could say that Deleuze and Guattari meeting and becoming friends, sure, Guattari was reading Logic of Sensitive Repetition, had some novel ideas that improved or progressed some of Deleuze's, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to start writing together and sort of form an assemblage, kind of like we've done on the podcast.
I didn't even finish my point, though. My point was kind of more like that. Okay, this sort of vestigial trace of this other territorial machine, let's say, persists even in our modern economy or justice, justice, like the justice system, the economy, and religion, right? Like those were all more spatially together, that, right? They've individuated a bit further out, but the sort of similar logic is in place in terms of the scapegoating of the working class and like the bourgeoisie. Under liberalism, capital L, and free markets, the old positions of authority that are like sort of locked in sense of maybe like the father being the head of the household. Now that is in question, it fucks up the circuits of desire or something. There's this similar function of the marketplace towards this sacrifice of the class who can't, like the potlatch, in a sense of the bourgeoisie are the ones that enable the proletarians to exist in a certain fucked up logic by being job creators. I think we've discussed this before. So there's a certain Oedipal triangular relationship between those that depend upon the bourgeoisie to provide jobs and sustenance for the proletarians to exist and reproduce themselves. I think that is tied up into this similar logic of the scapegoat, but I don't know, maybe in a reverse fashion, because I don't know how to square that with the way that the king would be a more powerful sacrifice than, maybe there's something about the way that we treat celebrities. Even cancel culture, I think, may be a manifestation of this similar process at work in the unconscious, and that we like raise these people up, but then there's a symbolic tearing down. So to recapitulate, after some technical issues, what I was going into was this notion of the scapegoat still applying, perhaps in the guise of the way that celebrities are treated and like cancel culture in our modern societies, almost like drawing from the example from H.G. Wells' The Time Machine with the Morlocks and the Eloys. There's that traditional annual sacrifice where the Eloys have to give one of their own over to the Morlocks. And so there's this, again, and it doesn't matter who the individual celebrity per se is, but someone who is sort of charged with this divine sanctity because the market, the gods, have selected them as someone who has the mana or what have you. This is another reason why I say all societies are primitive.
My analogy that I was thinking of on this level was how we responded to COVID and how so many people were just not deserving of protection or life. The old, the sick, but also like the essential workers have to keep the mechanisms, the wheels, keeping the ship of capitalism afloat. And so there was a kind of loose scapegoating there, and it's reminiscent of like the problem in Thebes and Oedipus Rex.
Yeah.
Who did this? Who caused this? You know, Oedipus is the the guy in the banana or the hot dog suit in the meme.
We're all wondering who did this.
Exactly. So with celebrity culture, like you were saying, yeah, there is the sense that, I mean, tabloids feed off this. There is a kind of collective joy and schadenfreude in the foibles and whatever of the downfall of the celebrities whom we've put on the pedestal. I'm trying to think. It's like empty calories type shit, right? You know, it's not a sustainable diet in the media literary sense, but it tastes good. If we want to say one thing about incest that I found interesting, and you can see this in Oedipus Rex, when Oedipus is first accused of being the source of the calamity that's plaguing Thebes, and this is obviously the same writer, Sophocles, it's the same kind of shit that he says at the beginning of Oedipus at Colonus, where he's basically saying, he's talking to Antigone and Ismene. And is there a third? There might be a third child. I don't remember, but I remember those two at least. And he's saying, I planted your seed in the same ground that I came out of. This is my way of trying to devil's advocate for Girard, where Oedipus is trying to say, I caused through incest this lack of distinction between father and brother. Through incest, I caused it such that I am your father and your brother. I caused this lack of differentiation in the family tree. And so that's the way that Sophocles kind of writes it. And he, of course, he puts it in this kind of tragic, poetic way, planting the seed in the same bed or whatever the fuck, you know, the same womb that he came out of. So incest, I think, functions here in these rituals. Like, for example, he looks at some societies where the king, before taking office, has to like perform a kind of symbolic incest ritual with the queen mother. Again, this goes back to the mono distinction that you made, right? The king himself has accumulated a kind of symbolic, prestigious, magical power, and it's through the incest ritual that's like the greatest crime of fucking up the coding of the flows. Even Deleuze and Guattari, you know, again, we'll return to this, think about incest in certain ways related to this, even though they deny that it can happen, right, in their own philosophical way. There is a sense in which it has to do with the coding of the germinal influx, right, and repressing it. Now, I think that that's interesting because the king performs this incest ritual that he's performed like the greatest crime. And then Girard even looks at some societies where the king has to like not just do incest, but all these other terrible things. It's as though, I think that he even says, in these societies, the king is ritually put to death after a certain period, or maybe even whenever there is some sort of imbalance. You know, there's no rain, you know, the crops aren't growing, blah, blah, blah. There's some sort of issue, but the king is like ritualistically put to death. Now, obviously, again, this is interesting to apply to something like Agamben, where you have a logic of effigy, right? You've got to kind of like kill the king twice, if you will. But I just think that notion of incest, as the way that Sophocles writes about it, as the great undifferentiator, the great sowing of chaos in the social order, the great leveler of distinctions, I think that adds a bit more insight into what Girard is thinking of. And so I'm only saying that to try to temper a little bit of my charge that he sounds like a conservative in saying that the sacrificial crisis is born of the downfall of distinctions, as though he's merely saying like, let's keep things as they are, let's keep capitalism in place or whatever. Not that he's necessarily an anti-capitalist, you can't really get a sense directly of his politics in these first 4 chapters that we looked at. But hopefully when we return to Girard, we might get a deeper sense. So I don't want to go out and say he's a reactionary straight out. It's just that you do feel like, oh, this guy's, obviously he's French, so he's a Catholic. Big guess. Great guess. But it feels like he's actually a believer. You know what I mean? Anyway.
I'm going to go ahead and read this section from the text because I think not only does it, I think, align with a little bit of what you were getting at, but I'm going to use this as a springboard to finish out my market hypothesis. Incest then is simply another aspect of the affliction that the rites are designed to prevent, but they attempt to prevent it by means of a cure that is intimately associated with the most virulent form of the affliction. The ritualistic mind thus finds itself obligated to separate what cannot be separated, and the solution must ultimately be an arbitrary one. That's key right there, right? The ritualistic mind is perhaps more willing than we are to admit that good and evil are simply 2 aspects of the same reality, but eventually it must distinguish between them. Even in the ritualistic framework, where there are fewer differences than in any other area of human culture, a distinction between the 2 must be apparent. The purpose of the rite is to consolidate this difference, newly restored after the terrible undifferentiation of the crisis. There is nothing arbitrary or imaginary about the difference between violence and nonviolence, but men will always treat it as a difference within a process that is violent from beginning to end. That is how the rite is made possible. The rite selects a certain form of violence as good, as necessary to the unity of the community, and sets up the opposition to it another sort of violence that is deemed bad because it is affiliated to violent reciprocity, right? Revolution, the retribution of the proletarian taking over and suppressing the bourgeoisie, right? And I think this is ultimately the neurotic aspect of Girard's. I think he has an anxiety about this very thing, but I'll go on with the actual text. In the same way, the rite can designate certain forms of incest as good, for example, royal incest, and others as bad. It can equally well decide that all forms of incest are bad and refuse to even admit even royal incest among those actions which, if not actually sacrificial in character, are still capable of contributing to the sacrificial powers of the monarch.
Before you go into the market stuff, I just want to say, to piggyback off of what you were saying about him being neurotic or playing out, it's almost he's thinking of the French Revolution ending in 1793, and Robespierre is the scapegoat to set an end to the terror.
Yes, exactly.
That's all I wanted to say. And then I'll let you have your.
Okay.
Go back to market.
First, let's go back to Potlatch, because Potlatch is ultimately operating on a logic of supply and demand, in the sense that there's a dialectical revolution, not revolution in the sense of violent revolution, but in the sense of this.
The circuit that you were talking about.
The circuit, right? Okay. The most important aspect of the Potlatch is the destruction of the
accumulated wealth.
The accumulated wealth, right? So that is a check. That's a supply and demand check on surplus production.
Right.
As we've said a number of times, right? The destruction of the usage of the surplus in the potlatch festivals, etc., keeps the scales of debt from ever getting too far out of control. Because if those get too far out of an equilibrium, then we wind up with violent revolution, or whatever, the society implodes into violence. Okay. So you can see the mechanisms of ultimately supply and demand in this dialectical self-regulating process. It's a self-regulating process. The market process of supply and demand is sort of operating on a similar logic, if you're following me so far.
Yeah.
So what happens with incest, and this even persists today, not specifically to incest, but the logic is similar in the way that if exchange is blocked, the way that incest blocks exchange with the other group, right? Because if I'm taking my sister as wife, that forecloses the ability to exchange. And whenever the ability to exchange with the other is
forecloses alliance.
It forecloses alliance, and violence is threatened. How you see this operate in our contemporary world is it's only those with whom we cannot exchange properly, in quotes. We don't exchange with our enemies, right? I guess it's a little bit decoded under capitalism.
No, but this is Baudrillard.
We sort of do exchange, like we exchange with China, but like we don't necessarily exchange with North Korea. I'm not sure about Iran, like George Bush's axis of evil. Those people that we don't directly exchange with are the biggest threat to our stability. Those are the ones who are scapegoated, are the ones that we can't, there's no reciprocity of exchange.
They're the surrogate for the
Cold
ledger. War. They're the surrogate for the Cold War type hostility.
Or even maybe like the US's ledger is so stacked, like the between us and like North Korea or something like that, that it threatens the whole stability of the world. I think there's a couple of different ways you can kind of read it. There's a little bit of loose, but I think that same idea of exchange being blocked, which is maybe a way to think of the flows being blocked, has something to do with this.
I guess I would say it's interesting. Yeah, this obviously brings up symbolic exchange and death vibes too. I'm glad. So we've gotten to hit all three. We've gotten to think about anti-Oedipus, libidinal economy a little bit. You said all societies are primitive, or no societies are primitive. That's kind of the interesting all or nothing argument. And then this question about exchange, right? Because Baudrillard's like, we're doled out little bits of death, and the only thing that the real thing that can't be symbolic exchange is like our immediate irreversible death. It's like, okay, thanks buddy. Yeah, I'll go jump off a cliff now and we'll see.
Well, I mean,
maybe that'll end
See,
capitalism.
I think you still see this. I mean, I think the Israel-Palestinian conflict in the sense of to go back to the spirit of terrorism, like I think that logic is very much at play, and the potlatch and this sort of inability to the mimetic violence of this conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians seems very that seems very germane. There's something going on with this inability to reconcile the debt that is perpetuating this sort of circuit of violence, right? Of like the blood feud, you know what I mean? Because there's something can't be exchanged, like the ledger's so fucked up, or like the flows are blocked, or like there's some kind of issue that is preventing there from being like this equilibrium point to be reached or something like that.
Yeah, and again, for Deleuze, the debt is Europe's, not Palestine's necessarily. But
so I think that the inability to resolve I don't know if there's something where the sort of the Israeli hostages that were killed supposedly or taken on October 7th, Israel's response to that is like obviously disproportional, insanely disproportional. I think there's something about trying to alleviate the debt, the symbolic debt, like that's the thing that can't be exchanged, right? That circuit of supply and demand is broken, or like debt and credit is broken, and so violence ensues. And I think maybe that's the germ of the whole sacred and the whole book. I mean, as far as what we read. So
yeah, I think that's good. All right, my battery is dying. I hate to be quick about this.
No, I think we can end there.
It's good. I love you. This was great. I liked your energy today a lot. And I do think that means we should return and read, maybe skip a few chapters, go to chapter 7, and there may be a little bit more we read. Maybe we read chapter 7 and his review of Anti-Oedipus. That'll be about 70 pages.
Sounds good.
Maybe a little bit less.
I'm down with that.
But for next week, I want to look at this. It's called The Vestal and the Fasces.
Okay.
That I want to see how long that is, and if we might, because I think that it'll continue some of the thinking you were doing about this question of the judicial system and the balancing of power and distribution of justice. Well, I will be sending you that shortly, and send me your Trump memes. Love you, buddy.
Love you too. And
good job today.
Thank you. That'll wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without option. This is the typical violence of information. Is violence
not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.